Thank you very much. Your talk connects to the debate about what kind of a paradigm shift we have here in medicine, and this is a thought, and I'm interested in how you see it. It seems to me that it's what you're describing is a great example of a case of phenomenal importance, which is a case of precision medicine, but is clearly not a case of a paradigm shift, but of continuity. And the reason is this. We can have a philosophical debate about, say, two conditions that have, the same etiology, the same histopathology, the same signs and symptoms, the same natural history, and yet we find out that they have different genetics and they respond differently to treatment, and then we have a question, are they still, the same disease or not the same disease? But in this case, it seems that a very basic issue, which is the main sign of the disease, was simply covert, right, because of the dissociation. So we simply didn't know it, which is unusual in diseases because usually signs show themselves, but here because it's a cognitive issue. Also, you mentioned that the histopathology may not have been known. You mentioned the mesocircuit. So it's a case of just uncovering something extremely important that wasn't known, but not a paradigm shift in thinking about it.
I think we could debate Kuhn till the paradigms come home, but if you read the story of the efforts to sort of tinker with Newtonian physics as they got to relativistic speeds, they tried to jerry-rig the old theory to accommodate the new data, the new reality, until Einstein had a kind of an overarching theory that was a better fit. So I don't know if we have a paradigm shift, but I do know that our field has dramatically changed. And I would say that, Mendel's pea plants looked the same in the first generation until they didn't, right? So there was a covert genetics, as to use that phrase, in the pea plants. So I think that and I think what Eric said before, there's almost like an accretion, and in consciousness we talk about it as an emergent phenomenon. There's an emergent accretion of information that told us that what we thought we knew was a degree of certainty was just wrong. And I think that ultimately, as this field evolves, we will have a lot of individualized predictions about individuals, and then there will be patterns and new probably classifications of individuals who can be grouped, loosely linked together. It will not be as binary. We know the biology is less binary than we thought. It's more continuous. But I think we're seeing a transition. And I share this as an example because I think it shows the overt, covert, phenotypic, genotypic in a different frame. I sort of feel like I'm an amateur student of cello late in life. So I feel like I'm coming to a violin concert and I'm talking about cellos amidst all the geneticists. But I think it's good to see the example in parallel. But I'm not sure if it's a paradigm shift or it's just been a repetition. And ironically, we're probably going to go back to the botanist, Aristotle, and having better classification. But it won't be genus, species. It won't be quite as concrete and as reified. And there'll be overlap that will be confusing. And one of the overlaps that we have with our population is that these are dynamic brain states. And the temporal component is if a patient looks vegetative clinically, and based on their circuitry, and then you stimulate them, you're seeing the potentiality. So there's potentiality, and I think that gets back to Lee's point about the potentiality to reverse, say, the inflammatory process. If it continues, you get diabetes. If it reverses, your C-reactive protein goes down, and you're less at risk for heart disease. So I think that there's a temporal component here as well, and I think epigenetics is part of that temporal component as well, with fixity of genetics plus epigenetic considerations as well.
Joseph, thank you very much. A really rich talk, much to bring up there. I want to relate what you had to say back to our concept note for the meeting. Are we going to cure all diseases and at what price? And I want to go to the issue of what price. And I think what you're bringing up is a rather large issue that I hope we'll talk about some, which is the price of uncertainty. And I also want to make a distinction before I say anything more, but there's a concept in the sociology of medicine where we distinguish between the illness experience and disease.
Right.
So disease is, is considered the biological manifestation, and illness is the experience of it. And the illness experience, of course, is related to the biological outcome because it affects how people feel and how their system reacts. So as we move into a period of medicine where we're increasing uncertainty, even though we may lead to a revolution in which we can cure disease, one of the costs is that we go through a phase of uncertainty. And there's a couple of sources of uncertainty that you have raised that I want to point out for us to consider. One is there's also the issue of uncertainty for who. And the first issue about uncertainty for who relates to the question of to whom is the difference visible? So when we're talking about these new imaging technologies, when we're talking about genomic technology, what we're talking about is a form of medicine where you move from what a patient can see themselves, so whether or not there are lesions on the skin or they're manifesting something and they experience it themselves, they know themselves these symptoms, to a set of symptoms that experts must tell them they have. So this was, one of the fundamental shifts in genomics was whether or not the layperson on the street could see human variation. And now we used to in the 1950s tell people that one of the reasons why these theories of science are true is because the layperson can see them. Anyone can see these differences between human beings. And now we're moving to a mode in which we're saying actually the person on the street cannot see. So the person on the street is an unreliable source of knowledge. So we're introducing a source of uncertainty that relates to the question of who knows. Mm-hmm. And then the second point is that we are moving from, I think, a kind of medicine that moves from knowledge to a kind of medicine that starts from data. And one question I would like to raise is to what extent, we've always had data, but the gap between data and knowledge, it seems to me, is broadening, which increases people's uncertainty because we give them lots of data, or we produce lots of data, but we often don't know what it means. And that in itself can produce ill effects for people. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't do this. I think it just means that we should think about how do we create a way of knowing as we shape this paradigm shift, whatever it's going to be. How do we shape it such that maybe the gap between data and knowledge is kept closer together than going like this? Right. Because otherwise I think you subject, maybe this is the question of at what price. So. Right.
So the price issue, we could, the economics I'll skirt because I don't want to burn time on that. But the issue of the accessibility of the data, although this is computational, it's also visual. And so families can actually see the pictures. So I can show you an image of a frontal cortex of a person who got zolpidem before and after that was hypoactive and then active. And so it may be more accessible for families, the person on the street. But if you want to do it as a patient-centered thing, which I think is compelling and it's a human narrative, is that if you actually consider the thought experiment of being one of those 41% of patients in nursing homes who have been misdiagnosed, thought to be unconscious when you're in the room and you're conscious. So it's actually, the family may or may not understand it, although if we tell family members, your loved one actually is able to hear you and can understand you. And then they understand what that means. But I'm concerned about the patient who was living in isolation, who was thought to be insensate. They get treatments without pain medicine. They get ignored in the room. So I think that is really the observation is really not so much observation, but the experience and the feeling that the patient has. So I think, and I agree with you, and I read your papers, and I think that there is a risk to making this so abstract that the citizenry cannot understand what we're talking about. But I think this gets to general points about scientific literacy. But here, I think, and the reason when I wrote my book using family narratives precisely to explain the science. And I told the story of one woman's trajectory, with interspersed other families, a woman named Maggie Worthen, who had a brainstem stroke and a bleed up into her thalamus as a senior at Smith College. Again, I have family permission to talk about that. I'm honoring her by mentioning her name here. I told her story in order to make it accessible. And I think your point about accessibility and engagement with outside of the scientific community is critical for this kind of work, and I try to endeavor to do that. But I totally take your point.
We will try to keep the time for the next lecture. And then I remind you that we have more than 30 minutes for general discussion. For the lecture that have been presented at the beginning, we can have more time for the questions that have not been presented now.